My name is Francesca Sartorio, so welcome to Cardiff. Croeso in Cardiff. I should have let Hugh say that, but there we go. And welcome to this event focusing on the meanings of the built environment, a recently published book by Federico Bellentani. The book stems from Federico's PhD research, and I've been lucky enough to be Federico's supervisor together with my colleague Hugh Thomas here at Cardiff. Federico's work links effectively methods and analytical frames developed in semiotics with those more commonly used within disciplines studying the built environment, to look specifically at monuments and memorials. His long-standing interest is on post-socialist countries, and his cases are based in Estonia. Beyond this, I find the richness of data and the methodological innovations Federico introduced most interesting, not least because from where I sit, and I'm a planner, I've got to say, they have the potential of hopefully potentially interact with planning theoretical approaches able to interpret the diversity of voices and perspectives in planning today, and maybe bridge the stalemate that we are in after the rise and demise of communicative planning and the complexity turn towards something that is able to support and aid also practical approaches and practical approaches to planning theory. We started talking about this event a while back as a book launch, but realized pretty quickly that maybe the book might be pivotal, not just marking the end, the conclusion of a PhD, but also maybe the start of a fruitful collaboration between semiotics and disciplines of the built environment. And so this event that looks at the future. All of you participating will receive an email with a call for papers for the Journal of International Planning Studies to develop these thoughts further. And this is the plan for the day, for the evening. I've given you my introduction, so that's it really. I'll leave the floor to Neil and Agustin, who are contemporaries of Federico. In part, their PhD research has overlapped with him. They've read the book, so they will share their views on Federico's contribution with us. Neil will focus on the conceptual and more planning and design related issues, looking at the materiality of the monuments and the built environment. And Agustin will focus more, he will have more of a social scientist gaze and look at history and memory and how Federico has used it. Federico then has got a handful of minutes to reply and comment on what Neil and Agustin have said. And then the floor is with Paul Copley from Middlesex University, who will address conclusions and an agenda for further research. And with this, I leave the floor to Neil. Do you want to start?
Thank you, Francesca. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for coming along. It's great to see so many familiar faces. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the huge amount of work that Federico has undoubtedly put into this book. It's not an easy task to write and publish a book, especially for early career scholars. So I'd like to take the opportunity to recognise this and to recognise this work and to congratulate Federico for this, for his achievement. I think especially because the book clearly makes a number of important contributions to knowledge across several disciplines. And my own interest in the book is based on looking at how space is produced, to which Federico provides a rigorous, theoretically based framework, which can be used to further understandings of monuments and more widely of space and the built environment. So today, this afternoon, I'd like to share some thoughts around 3 contributions that I think the book makes. And Federico, I have 3 questions for you in relation to these, which I'd invite you to reflect on and to respond to. The first contribution I'd like to discuss is related to your empirical work that Francesca has already mentioned. In your work, you meticulously detail the mundane, everyday experiences of monuments and the way in which people exercise their own agency around these spaces. And this often contrasts, as you say, with the official narratives and the design intentions behind these physical spaces. So I think your example of the Victory Column monument is particularly strong in this case. And you talk about how the design of the monument was highly prescribed by expert design professionals and, of course, the authorities who were commissioning it. You talk about the space being curated based on the idea of a model user who would correctly recognize the iconography and acknowledge the commemorative purpose of the monument. But I think most interestingly, you show with your empirical evidence that the space has not been recognized as such and has otherwise attracted uses that are different from those envisaged. So instead of promoting sort of official acts and acts of nationhood, you talk about how there are skaters and bikers, and to use your language, you talk about the flat ground and the sharp curves that they use for sport, which then provoked the council to put up physical signs that advised the public to please behave responsibly and with dignity in the space of the monument. What's interesting here is that the everyday experience of the space, which you define through Lefebvre's idea of lived space, that is space as representational space, and to quote you quoting Lefebvre, is directly lived, space that's directly lived through its associated images and symbols, and hence the space of inhabitants and users, end quote. So lived space appears to be dominant in this case, which led me to think about questions about agency in space. To what extent and in what ways can people transcend the official narrative and physical nature of these spaces through everyday life and practices and exercise some form of agency over official narratives? Or in Lefebvre's terms, how can lived space, that space which is defined by its users, be more important than both the conceived space, which is the space of the official space, the official designation of the space, and the perceived space, which is the physical nature of the space? So does this lived space represent a more emancipatory notion of space and or simultaneously recognize the limits of official control over space? Secondly, I'd like to focus on a methodological contribution that I think you've made through this work. In your case study, the relocation of the bronze soldier, you give an account of the many ways in which very different groups try to assert their power over and or try to dominate the narrative around what should happen to this monument. I won't recount the case here because I think people would more enjoy reading the account in the book. But you do draw attention in this case to and go beyond the conflicts that arose in relation to narratives of an ethnic clash between communities within Estonia. You talk about political struggles around elites and political groups that make use of the past to exercise power both within Estonia and also actors who are external, who also try to influence what happens. So in documenting this case, you show how despite these often unequal power relations, the boundaries between, and here you're drawing on Bourdieu, the boundaries between different interpretive communities remained indeterminate and in constant negotiation. So what's interesting is there's an openness to space here and a non-determinism in the way that we understand the space that doesn't predetermine outcomes and offers opportunities for conversations to be held. So here I think your approach has 2 methodological contributions. Firstly, it recognizes and documents the multiplicity of understandings that influence the production of these monuments, makes an important methodological contribution by offering a framework to account for this plurality. And this also helps to describe how the space is subjected to different power dynamics. And secondly, your work goes beyond a description and proposes that such an inquiry can serve as a framework to guide approaches to how we manage these monuments. So this is sort of the practical side of the framework that Francesco was talking about. So you talk about a practical application can offer design strategies to widen public participation, and I will quote, where you say, crisis should be avoided if dialogue is practically expressed through participatory approaches to the design and cultural reinvention of monuments, end quote. So in bringing together these two different approaches, the descriptive and the search for solutions, you provide an important methodological contribution and advance in thinking about how to understand and manage space. So my question here, and it's a big question, but then what in terms of the tension, what tensions do we see arising from combining these two approaches, and what suggestions do you have maybe to begin to resolve them? And I'll leave that there for you to think about. Thirdly, and finally, your work makes an important conceptual and theoretical contribution around how we think about power. How do we think about power in a framework that seeks to resolve multiple understandings of one space? They're often in tension or in conflict. I think power is one of the underlying themes of your book. You talk variously about power at different times through power as political, where you talk about the erasure of obsolete political monuments, or the placement of a new nationalist totem, which is one of the monuments. You also talk about sharing power in the case of marginally, in the case of the memorial landscapes, there's a sharing of power. And you also talk about the power of the market. And this relates to sort of economic power and the use of monuments to enhance marketability and enhance sort of tourism. And this is in the case of the kissing students. So thinking about power leads to my final question. To what extent might power be challenged through this framework? And what limits might there be to this, and what opportunities? On that note, I'd like to thank you, Federico, for inviting me to participate today. It's been a pleasure to have the opportunity to engage with your book and engage with the work more closely. And I look forward to your reflections and the further discussions around your book this afternoon. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Neil. I would suggest we'll move to Agustin first to give Federico a bit more time to think about the answer. Okay. Also, maybe he can, pull all points and answer, in a structured way. One thing I didn't say earlier on is if there is any comment or questions from the audience, pop them in the chat and we will address them at our earliest opportunity. So I'll leave now the floor to Agustin. Thank you, Neil.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been 3 years now that I left Cardiff, so to be here again I'm very happy. So thank you for this invitation, and it's really good to see all friends and colleagues here again. So I'm very happy to be here as well, because I met Federico in January 2014 when we both started the PhD in Cardiff. And so I saw the development of this book since it was a research proposal. So it's a fantastic achievement to see this published as a book, and I'm very happy about it. I wanted to congratulate Federico, because I read the book and I really enjoyed it. It is very well written. I think you guide the reader very well. It's very easy to read the book, so thank you for that. I really enjoyed how you put into conversation the semiotics part with cultural geography. I think it's a big contribution of the book. and also, as Neil suggested, the detailed empirical material. So I learned a lot about Estonia, a country that I have to recognize that I didn't know much. So all the details of the empirical material that you give was very useful for understanding the context and the situation there. Well, my research at the moment is more about tourism and Airbnb, but my previous work was about urban history and the political use of historic monuments. So I think Federico invited me today because of this past I had as an historian. And so my approach to the question of monuments comes from history as a discipline. And so my reflections and discussion about the book come from this background. And I know that Federico's approach is different, but I have some comments that maybe it can contribute and help Federico to think about different things around the book. I have 3 points also. My first point is a mix of questions and comments. My first point is more of a definition, and it's a definition of monuments that you give, because I think this conditions the rest of the book, because your definition is you define monuments as something erected to celebrate an event. But I think that the definition of monument is bigger than that, especially because users and elites can appropriate objects, buildings, and change the meaning of those buildings and identify some buildings as monuments for them, for things or events that they want to celebrate from the past. So there is an object like a cathedral, for example, that was not built as a monument, but is today a monument. And this was already suggested a century ago, but Alois Briegel in the Modern Cult of Monuments. And I think it's very important to semiotics, because how people can change the meaning of buildings. And I think this is relevant for your work and for the question of the lived space that Neil was suggesting now. And in relation to this, the second point is the question of monuments and the creation of national states, because I think it's a very, very relevant case for you. Estonia as a new created state, first in 1918, and then after the Soviet Union collapsed. And there is something very important how political elites for the creation of national state used buildings or monuments from the past to dictate like an ideal era to justify the creation of a new nation. And I know that you didn't explore this in the book, but I'm very curious to know more about what happened in Estonia about this, and what is the relationship between the use of the past, the use of monuments from the past in the present by the political elites that you mentioned, and how these political elites also created the memorials that you studied. So this is something that I was wondering if you could give more information about this, if this is something that happened in Estonia or not. I'm very curious. I'm very curious about that. And then my final point is more about politics and a bit about comparison. Because I know that your framework, your theoretical framework, is to put cultural geography and semiotics together, which is very good, and you did it very well, and it's very easy to understand your framework. But I also think that there are other examples very related to what happened in Estonia that could have been useful for you to interpret your results. And I'm thinking, for example, in what happened in Germany after the Berlin Wall and the creation of Berlin as a national capital, and how they reconfigured the city and erected memorials, used monuments, etc. So I think that there are other cases that you can use, not to do empirical comparison, of course, but at least to see what happened in other cases, which are in a context very, very similar to Estonia, to interpret your results. And I think that I'm curious if you have explored that possibility as well. And also because, for example, in the first two empirical cases that you mentioned, which is the bronze soldier and the victory column, I mean, it's very important here to talk about politics, because they were led by far-right movements, and they use techniques that were used by totalitarian regimes in the past, like the fascist Italy in Rome, for example. And also, I think that a quote from one of your interviews also mentioned that. So I think that there are many examples in the 20th century that could be used to put your findings into conversation with something that were happening in other places in Europe as well. So I just wanted to congratulate you for the book, and I would like to know more about these 3 points that I mentioned.
That's brilliant, Agustin. Thank you so much. And I think we can leave the floor to Federico now to address all these points. You've got an easy job today. Federico, I'll leave it to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm very, very happy and very grateful, and I would like to thank Neil and Augustine for such a precious feedback, which will definitely help me in improve my research and go on with that. Thank you also for the question. Are those very interesting, and I will try to give a first answer today. I will start with the question by Neil. I will come back to your first question, that was to what extent and in what ways can people transcend the official narrative and physical nature of space through everyday life and exercise agency over official narratives. And then you also ask if can, in Lefebvrean terms, lived space be more important than the conceived space, and if does this represent a more emancipatory notion of space and simultaneously recognize the limits of official control of space. So I think that the limits of the conceived space that define officially are represented in what I call the paradox of monuments. Monuments are meant to be stable over time in their physical form and function, according to their authors at least, but their meaning are very dynamic, and they reflect changes in culture, social relation, concept of nation, view of the past, and so on. I don't think that the meaning of monument as defined by user are necessarily more important. Actually, we know that the elites are the ones that have the power to erect monuments and then to convey specific meaning and historical narratives through them, encouraging specific future expectation on the basis of which to set some their cultural and political agenda. It is them that get the monument done in the end of the day. Of course, the monument design, the design and planning processes behind it can be inspired by a large number of ideas and values, but eventually there is only one consistent resolution. For sure, though, the agency of users, as you said, and their practices attach new, different, sometimes even contrary meanings to monuments. And there are, we see also very recently, some bottom-up practices that refashion in different ways the official meaning of monuments, including practices like skating and biking around monuments, like mocking or using irony to change their meaning, like covering with some textile the monuments in order to hide their materiality, to change their meaning through graffiti or street art, using digital technology to refashion their meanings, such as digital projectoring or virtual reality, augmented reality, or even destroying or removing the monuments, as it was for the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol during the Left Black Movement protest, Black Lives Matter, sorry, protest. Considering the practices, then in the end, in conclusion, the book, yes, advanced a more emancipatory notion of space, whose meaning originate from the interplay of the perspective of the designer and of users, while considering also the impact of monument on the everyday practices of people. Now, your second question, which was what tension do you see arising for combining the two approaches, the descriptive, the documenting, and the search for solution, and what suggestion do I have to resolve them? Well, I would say that the search for solution has to be informed by the description and the analysis of the multiplicities of understanding that influence the production of the meaning of monument. This is why semiotics can be useful for planners, I guess, providing tools to understand the multiplicity of meaning embodied in monuments and practices centered on them. On the other hand, and it might sounds different, like also the semiotician have to be planners somehow to contribute to understanding on how dialogue, meaning making, interpretation can be practically expressed through participatory approach to the design of monuments. Planning and semiotic together can then prove really useful, not necessarily avoiding conflict at any cost, if we take the example of controversial monuments, but to provide solution to reimagine monuments as learning venues rather than spaces inspiring controversies. And sometimes the solution may be even quite simple and even simpler than expected, such as, for example, the use of digital technology or social network practices to engage with the controversial meaning of monuments. Now, your final question, which was to what extent power can be challenged through the framework of my book to recognize the multiple interpretation of monuments, and what limits might there be and what opportunities. This is, of course, we will need a lot of time to discuss this, but I will give a first question at least. I think it is inevitable to think about monument and memorial as an expression to the dominant political power that want them to be erected. On the other hand, it is as well inevitable for them to generate multiple meaning and interpretation, and sometimes even very fierce debates at the societal level. As such, we can offer a more semiotic view on power. As already Roland Barthes said, and here I quote, we have believed that power was an exemplary political object. We believe now that power is also an ideological object, that it creeps in where we do not recognize it at first, into institution, into teaching. Power is present in most delicate mechanism of social exchange, not only in the state, in classes, in groups, but even in fashion, public opinion, entertainment, sports, news, family, private relationship, and I will add, of course, the built environment and the monuments and memorials specifically. So here the semiosis of power, semiotician would say, has to be seen as a process of interaction, perception, and interpretation of science at different level. Meets text, space, ideology, and so on and so forth, which create some hierarchical relations within some system, different codes, languages, discourses, as well as in cultural spaces. I hope to have given some at least first answer to your question, Neil. I will now pass to Augustine, and thank you also to your very interesting comments and questions, and thank you also for reminding our moment, great time in Cardiff. So okay, your first was really as a comment, and I agree on the definition of the monuments and on the connection to Alice Regel and so on. So I will just pass to the second question which for me very interesting and central to improve my research. Your question, put in simply, was what kind of invention of tradition one can find in Estonia, and if you made some example, and if those examples has happened also in Estonia. I would say that still today in Estonian elite try to find continuity with a sort of pre-occupation, meaning the occupation of the Soviet Estonia from Second World War till 1991, and sort of golden era. Estonia has been often occupied by foreign forces throughout its history, but it was independent from 1918 to the Second World War. So, and 1918 is considered as the year of foundation of Republic of Estonia. Symbol and architecture coming from the period, so between 1918 and 1939, are considered as a model. As for monument, the transition to democracy, going also to consider this, the transition to democracy up to today coincides with a trajectory of reinvention of monuments that one can find in the book that can relate to some example that you were quoting, Augustine. So first is removal and relocation of Soviet-built environment in general and monuments in particular. Then there is a second phase of rewriting through direction of new monuments and memorial. First, in a more imposing way, we'll say, as in the case of the Victory Column that you mentioned, and later in a more participatory way in the past year. And finally, there is a sort of added phase, if you don't want to, added phase where there is the building of built forms that less evidently relate with political and historical meaning. Some more universal and more general built form, as for example the Keys Institute in Tartu, that relate indeed, as say, to more general meaning, more general narratives, and they add the also the space with less politicized, let's say, practices. Regarding your question whether I checked the historical literature you mentioned, I am aware of this literature, but in the book, as for the moment, I prefer to link my case studies to other monuments in countries in Eastern Europe or the world, so to focus on other example in space rather than example in time. But I thank you for this question, because this definitely is a point for future research. Case studies are compared in the book by similarities and dissimilarities with example also in Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Bulgaria, but also in countries in Central Asia like Kazakhstan, just to speak of post-Soviet and post-socialist countries. So there is also some connection with other controversial monuments, just to say that this is something that really relates to the everyday life in different geographical spaces in different states. For example, as there are some other examples in European Union or in North America. An example is offered in the Confederate monuments in the US and other monuments that were considered to celebrate slavery and racism in the EU that were removed, or plans for removal were announced during the protests following the killing of George Floyd in 2020. This adds to several others across the world, for example, the ongoing debate of the urban legacy of fascism in Italian cities, as you said, for example. So future research definitely will explore how the historical literature you mentioned can be useful to throw new lights on the result of the book. I hope to have given a first question, at least, to your very interesting, a first answer to your very interesting question. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Federico. I was so worried that we would run over time, and we have done actually quite well. So I think we'll pass the floor and the mic, virtual mic, to Paul Cobley from Middlesex University to discuss conclusions and future research agenda, before then having a bit more time maybe for questions and answers. And as said earlier, if you've got any question, immediate or else, pop them in the chat and we'll make sure we go through them in order. Okay, so Paul now.
Thanks indeed for that. I'm sharing screen now because I have a PowerPoint presentation. It's just some headings. There's nothing complicated here, I hope. So let me put it onto slideshow, therefore. Okay, I'll try not to speak for too long, although I've been asked to say something about the relevance, I guess, for this study in relation to the future of semiotics. And it occurred to me that perhaps I should say something general about semiotics as well, not just its implications as we have them here. And the reason for that, I think, is that basically everybody does semiotics in the same way as everyone does psychology. But you know, to actually study semiotics, what is involved? Well, happily, there's a nice case study in this volume of Federico's, I think, and you know, it acts as a very good guide to semiotics in some respects, and also points to the future in a number of ways. So, oh, sorry, this should play from the start. Play from the start again. So let me take you through some of the very broad stroke ways in which I think that this book indicates some existing agendas for semiotics, but also some agendas for the future of semiotics, and you know, perhaps an agenda, well, for everyone, not just for semiotics as well. So sometimes people define semiotics in terms of theoretical studies of the sign and very complicated ontologies and taxonomies of signs, which it can be very off-putting. My mentor, Tom Sebeok, used to refer to semiotics in terms of reality and illusion. I think I will probably emphasize here, in relation to Federico's book, another couplet, which is awareness and critique. But there are further couplets that or perhaps they're even binary opposites, which I will set out before you. So one issue which runs strongly through this book, and it remains an issue for semiotics or any studies in meaning, is the difference between strong coding and weak coding. Okay, strong coding should be enshrined in monuments. Traditionally, that's what monuments do. They operate on the basis of a strong coding. This is what this monument means forever. Well, I mean, this book throws that into disarray rightly as a you know, quite unitary perspective, and we do that in semiotics all the time. We are dealing often with interpretation or weak coding. In a sense, I'm thinking that the approach to the built environment in this book, in this study, it's analogous, at least in one way, to Umberto Eco's view of books. He calls them lazy machines. The interpretation has to be done from outside. It doesn't get done once and for all at the inception of the monument. Okay, so this is a perennial problem for, or more perennial advantage sometimes for semiotics and the way that it's studied. Another issue which is attendant on that, and I'm stating it in a very general way, but I hope that it kind of makes sense to people who may not be used to semiotics as a way of thinking, is the difference which is sometimes seen between ideation and interpretation. What comes through strongly in this book is that interpretation is happening from the outset. It's not a matter of working out what a monument is, although that does happen. It's not a matter of the public somehow decoding a monument or finding out a denotation. The public come to monuments already with connotations, and that's the first thing that happens when you encounter a monument. So to put it another way, ideation doesn't necessarily come before interpretation. The other issue I think that is dealt with strongly in this book, and it represents a number of suggestions for the future, is the difference between memory at collective and individual levels, and memory when you think about it in terms of what populations do. So I think in particular of the whole field of memory studies, which deals with collective and individual memories, often suggesting that one collapses into the other. Individual memory is often collective, as Bartlett and others have said for many years. And then at the same time, you have this tension at the level of memories of populations. And related to that, I think, in semiotics is the distinction between analog and digital signs. Now, there isn't an immense amount of discussion in this book of digital signs, although in a way, perhaps the future of monuments might be digital. The future of the built environment as a whole might be digital in certain ways that we approach it as human interlocutors. Sorry, I skipped a slide there. I noticed Kalvi is in the audience today, so I'm delighted to welcome him from Estonia. But to refer back to this issue of populations and analog and digital, action in a lifespan tends to be dominated by analog signs, changeable and interpretable to different degrees. And the built environment, we usually think of it in terms of this changeable and interpretable nature that seems to harbor. Genetic coding, genetic memory is kind of unchangeable. It's as Kalvi would say, it's read-only. Okay, so I decided to quote him before I saw him in the audience, I promise. So the passing on of digital memory can only be seen at the level of the population. And it struck me quite forcibly when I was reading this book quite recently, that what it's talking about is what populations do, how they respond to the built environment, not just through individual agency, but collectively, and what we can draw off from that, how we can make predictions based on that, and how we can do, well, how we can do this thing called planning. The other thing that the other theme that this book bears on is one that's extremely important to contemporary semiotics and elsewhere as well, I would warrant, is the distinction, or sometimes the lack of distinction, between the global in understanding of the world around us and the local, or what Federico calls more idiosyncratic bearings of the phenomena that we encounter in our environment. Okay, that's absolutely central to semiotics, that distinction, or sometimes conflation, and it's certainly evident in this discussion in this book. And then I come to this issue of awareness and critique. And I mention these partly to hark back to what I mentioned at the outset of this brief discussion, but also to face forward to the idea of planning, which runs through the conclusion of the volume. For me, semiotics really is about the degrees to which we can impute signhood, or we can recognize signs, which humans seem to be unique as a species in doing, and the extent to which we can implement that recognition for the purposes of critique, to see what we've done wrong, to put it in a demotic sense, and also to see what we can plan for the future. Okay, so awareness and critique are absolutely essential to this volume. And then something more problematic in semiotics I encounter all the time, and it's to do with the way that people write. It's sometimes unavoidable, but in this volume, it's dealt with in quite an exemplary way. And it's the difference between semiotic quality or communicative efficiency. Okay, and I equate this a little bit with the early discussion that we had of planning, and a more ethical, critique-based understanding of how semiotic artifacts work. Okay, ethical in the sense of projection, so it's certainly planning, but at the same time, ethics, which is in a way compulsive. It's kind of forced upon us in the sense that there are inescapable factors which have to be taken into account in planning. And in the conclusion of the volume in particular, that comes across very strongly. So on that note, I'd like to stop sharing, but just to conclude with an architectural metaphor again. I saw this work well, not at its inception, during a gestation period, and I later was one of the people that commissioned this work as a volume in a series that I co-edited for in De Gruyter. Amongst the many qualities of the author that I appreciated was bridge building. Okay, bridge building is extremely valuable, and he will probably say modestly that he merely wished to make some links between cultural geography and semiotics, but that kind of bridge building that he's engaged in can sometimes be epoch making. We'll have to wait to see if that's the case. Many thanks.
That's lovely, Paul. Thank you so much. So much to think about and take forward and elaborate. I think without further ado, to maybe leave some space for questions and answers. And it would be great if you could just jot them in the chat, or the first one could go ahead and talk, and then all the others go in the chat. And feel free to ask questions or just simply comments for clarification, or to delve deeper and take forward some of the thoughts that we've heard.
Can I ask something?
Of course you can. Yes, go ahead, Agustin.
I just was wondering, Federico, if you can explain a bit more why you selected these 4 cases and not others.
Yes, thank you. Is the trajectory of cultural invention, as I call it in the book, I was trying to explain before. So from removal and relocation to the creation of a new built environment, which most resemble the current needs of Estonian culture and society. So from dramatic relocation of an important memorial, the so-called Bronze Soldier, which kept the attention of all over the world in Estonia, to the Victory Column, which is the a rewriting, as I was saying before, an erection of a new memorial done using certain kind of imposing design and without using participatory methods, and that resulted into the Estonian population not recognizing themselves in the memorial, which commemorate the people that died in the War of Independence, as I was saying, between 1918 and 1920. And then we see that in 2018, the 100th anniversary of Estonian Republic, a new memorial, the victims of the memorial to the victims of communism, that use participatory methods and is connected with other memorials around in a memorial landscape nearby Tallinn. And in the end, I said these more general and universal symbols that are often erected in Estonia, but throughout all over Eastern and Central Europe, but I would say Europe in general. So characters that come from fairy tales, pop culture, symbols, or characters, symbols that come from you know, the tourism. This is more connected also to what you do, you know, so some tourist symbol and so on and so forth. So those that, you know, somehow add commercial value also to space and fill the space with more general practices of consumption of space. That's also an interesting topic to focus on future research.
Thank you, Federico. Anybody else? Because otherwise I've got a question. Oh, Paul. Yes, Paul, go ahead.
Okay, I'll try and keep it short. So, Federico, I mentioned ethics, and in relation to the last question, you refer to the countries in your case study as transitioning, you know, which I tend to think is already, there's already an ethical imperative in that. So how would you characterize what they are transitioning to? We
all are in transition, so that's a problem I'm facing today. So a few weeks ago, the former president of Estonia say, why do you still call us post-Soviet if, you know, we were a Soviet republic 21 years ago? The war goes fast. Still this name. That's absolutely true, and we need to fix also our language. So in this respect, we need to find a way to call a country in Central, Eastern, but also Northern or Eastern Northern as Estonian Europe, which definitely all are very different from each other, all have very different ideas. The risk is, you know, to make a group all together. I hope that in the book, with a bit of description, as Ney was saying before, I try to make a point and to characterize in the empirical material the difference of all this country, using post-Soviet as a name, just referring to the theoretical part of the book. So I was needed to focus on those transition from being Estonia, a Soviet Republic, into being an independent republic, into another very important transition, be a member of European Union. And be a member of European Union really changes the way Estonian institution, planners and designers deal with the built environment in general, and Monuments Memorial specifically. So this name is there used in a context. So yes, there's the need also to find a new way to update our language.
I fully agree. Recently I had to organize an event, and the countries referred to that were involved in the event were Eastern European. You know, this is the English designation, but that's from the Cold War. You know, they're neither in the East, and some of them aren't even European.
Yes. Neil, I see a raised hand. Sorry, Francesca.
Yes, that's really interesting in thinking about transition. And I was thinking about how your work might relate to a British context, and how the idea of is the UK in transition, in some sort of transition, where there is a reassessment of monuments in the UK, and there's a recognition of the slave trade in Bristol, and there's also recognition by the National Trust of the histories of some of its properties that are linked to that. So would your idea of transitioning also then be applicable to the UK? And I just wondered what you think about that.
Thank you. Coming back also to what Augustine was saying before, I tried to make some comparison from similarities and dissimilarities with other example all over the world. Really, in the book they're just mentioned. Maybe, of course, we can go in detail. I think I don't have. I'm not an expert in defining if the UK is in transition or not, but their assessment of the values, fortunately, you know, while the monuments are still in their materiality, and we think they are fixed, you know, in their ontology, let's say, fortunately, the way, the concept of nation, the social dynamic of inclusion and exclusion, the way we see at the past, fortunately changes. That's why we need to find even more creative and innovative solution to deal with what we cannot, for other reasons, for example, economic, remove from the space. So we all are in a process of reassessment continuously. I would say, also linking to what Paul today explained regarding the semiotic aspect of it. And yeah, so regarding the UK, this book was get light while you know, the Edward Colston statue was thrown in the harbor of Bristol. So of course it took more into the how to deal with controversial monuments, and we had discussed a lot on how to find some solution. And again, I would say that the solution is not avoiding the conflict, which we cannot do, but with using that, as you were saying, double methods, no? So the documenting and searching of solution, can we at least avoid the huge problems, let's say, at the societal level, and try to turn monuments into learning venues rather than places inspiring controversies.
Great, Federico. So we've got a couple of hands up. I've got a question from Gabriel in the chat, which I'll read aloud, but Gabriel, please feel free to add. what's the impact of the so-called cancel culture on the semiotics of monuments and memorials? And Gabriel, I don't know if you want to add something or whether Federico replies. Federico, then do you want to?
Well, already the name cancel culture can be actually very semiotic, if you want. You know, we have this idea of erasing, if you want, as you can erase a text or erase a book, and also the concept of culture, which is surely central to semiotics. What semiotics can do with that, as I was saying, I guess it's to really focus on the multiple interpretation and the multiple and sometimes troublesome meaning making around monuments and memorials. Having a clear picture and a dynamic picture of the different interpretation monuments have in a particular time and space can really help institution, department of heritage, local government, designer, planners, artists, and so on and so on and so forth. Regarding the cancel culture, obviously there is this idea of the question is always which kind of solution, and as said, is quite complicated for several reasons: economic reason, political reason, social and cultural reason, and so on and so forth, to reassess completely the space where we live, especially when it comes to architecture and built environment. You know, it costs a lot, and you need to pass through certain kind of political, I would say also in Europe, democratic processes to change the name of a street, to remove a statue, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, I don't have a clear solution because every case is different, right? So we need to document and search for solution for the specific case, as we were saying before. But if we focus on the interpretation and we use a little bit of semiotic in these terms, definitely we can go in toward this idea of monuments as learning, not monument as conflict.
Thank you, Federico. There was a hand up by Hugh, whom I've lost. Are you there, Hugh?
Yeah, here I am. Sorry about that. I'm not sure whether it was something, actually. I was going to make some comment and observation, ask a question when Paul was talking, and maybe now it'll take us somewhere different. So, but for what it's worth, it was the talk about ethics and emancipation and so on. And it just reminded me really that Federico is his study, which I've enjoyed, you know, over a number of years, seeing develop and so on. But his study is very much set within a particular political context. And I just wondered to what extent your kind of approach and thoughts would change if, for example, you were looking at the ways in which, I don't know, sanctification, say, of a particular person, that's to say, a particular person being raised to sainthood within, say, for example, the Catholic Church, creates then a particular kind of landscape. Certain places, certain bits of the material realities achieve a different kind of status, have a certain kind of status, which one could call monuments, I guess, in a certain sense. And that process has a completely different dynamic, typically, from the one you're sort of discussing in the Estonian context. I mean, it isn't that participation doesn't exist, because quite often, unsurprisingly perhaps, you know, people who are elevated to sainthood are are people who strike a particular response amongst believers. Quite often there's a bottom-up, as it were, surge of support for someone to become a saint. But on the other hand, the decision is very definitely taken from the top down. It's a pontifical decision, and the role of the believers, as it were, is to align their will with, as it is for any believer really, to align their will with that of the church. And they would see emancipation and freedom as much in a sort of Kantian sense, really, as aligning one's will with the moral law, defined in this case by essentially church authority and so on. So it isn't that. So the whole kind of dynamic of the creation of monuments, and then the way they play a part in people's lives, and what the lived reality of them is, and how that might or might not be in tension with particular intentions from elsewhere, and so on and so forth, would be slightly different. Well, more than slightly different, I guess. And clearly that would be a different kind of, all these phrases that Neil was using, emancipation, freedom, participation, and so on, would have a different sort of resonance really in that context, wouldn't they? But as I say, it's almost taking us into a different study, really. But anyway, so that's why I hesitated about saying much. But for what it's worth, there it is.
Well, that's really interesting. I will take it as a comment, and interesting and important to improve my research. When you say aligning the people's will from the top-down decision or the bottom-up idea of sanctify, for example, a person, and so on and so forth. Well, this book and my theoretical methodological framework, I guess, can be useful in consider that also when we align that will, we can differently align it. I don't know how to say, right? So even when we say, okay, the local government of my city has just erected a statue, and okay, fair enough, it doesn't really relate to me at the moment, and people have other stuff to do, thinking about this, and it's fine, it's okay, right? But still I can not like it, I can have problem with it, I can be part of a minority which does not recognize its narrative. I can very often not like the location where the monument is because it disturbs other architecture around, or I can not like the way it's done also very often, right? Especially with new monuments, with contemporary architecture. Who likes contemporary architecture, especially in older cities, and so on and so forth, the typical debates that we see. But also, and this is the case of controversial monuments, which are those monuments whose for the majority or for an influential part of the society are considered as bringing outdated value to space, or even reminding traumatic memories, or bringing outdated values. In that case, then there is a disalignment. When there is this disalignment, what are the solution? And I guess that, as said before, using a bit of semiotics, but also consider the cultural context, so connecting it with the cultural geographical thought concept, can be useful, and actually quite easier, I would say, even cheaper, if you want, than having major problem at societal level. I don't know if it makes sense, my answer.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks.
Any other question, comments? So,
if I may.
Yes.
So I'm very glad of today's event, and also Federico spent much time in our semiotics department in Tartu. We were happy to have him. So in concerning monuments, I think these are really good object for study meanings and particularly even this meaning and interpretation conflicts. So in our country, actually our department has received a couple of times from the government requests to provide semiotic analysis in case of some monuments which around which some conflictual situation was arising. And so here, this this provides some sort of natural semiotic experiment, even what can be very nicely studied and has been studied by Federico. Now, for us, now Federico's work appears as just textbook already for our semioticians in Tartu. But my question is simple: say whether you had, Federico, some theoretical insight during this research, what it was.
Thank you very much for the question, and well, I'm very glad you hear Kalevi. Professor Kalevi Kul has always been one of my mentor, and was very welcoming in the department of semiotics, one of the most important in the world, in Tartu, where I did the fieldwork. From a theoretical point of view, surely, as said also before by Paul, the connection between semiotics and cultural geography was the aim of my research, to advance the understanding of the connection between semiotic and cultural geography. And this is actually quite simple, you know, to consider on one hand the meaning making and interpretation of space, but on the other hand to consider the cultural space where they actually occur. So it seems quite simple actually, as we see. Normally in this respect, to go a little bit more in details, concepts from semiotic of culture from the Tartu Moscow Semiotic School definitely help in understanding this from the work of Yuri Lotman with the semiosphere and the culture and explosion couplet, jointly with some rereading, let's say, of Umberto Eco part of semiotics, which refer more to semiotic of culture, so to the concept of the encyclopedia, which include all the possible interpretation of a certain text to the theories related to the interpretation and reading of text, so the modern reader and the different multiple reading that a text can have, following or less a certain model that was designed from at the top level, from the author level. So I guess those so the connection between semiotic and cultural geography and concept from the semiotic of culture are some theoretical insights that are at the center of the book, and I hope to my future research.
Many thanks and best wishes to the future.
Many thanks to you.
Any other question or comments? So I've got one then, if what's the others think, maybe, for a last question. And is, whilst you were working on your PhD, We've had countless conversations about this circle. The monument, the memorial is at the center of a cultural context. And yet that memorial and that monument helps shapes meaning making. And that meaning making and the actions that ensue from that form and develop the cultural context itself. And we've had several conversations around this issues with Hugh and you. And we've discussed several times how in the built environment disciplines, all too often there is a deterministic approach towards the built environment and monuments, or the materiality of the environment. What is your position now after you've finished your work and some time has passed about that relationship? So meaning making shapes culture, but culture is also the context for the production of the built environment, which in turn, where do you stand now?
I guess still there, I would say. I guess still there in terms that I still see, and of course we can have even, I would be very happy to have even more and more countless conversation on this, where I see, for example, if you take the idea of monuments, obviously are a result of a certain culture that construct them, but on the other hand, once constructed and once these semiotic processes continue and all the multiple interpretation, multiple uses occur around the space, within the space of the monuments, then they also contribute to the cultural context. They give an actual contribution, and when it comes to controversial monuments, even more, because then they start to be represented in different ways in political discourse, in the everyday discourse, in the news, on the social media, on the web, and so on and so forth. So in this respect, and this may be a limitation which I would address, I'm still in this circle.
And another question, which is actually, after this last couple of years with so much happening, not just a pandemic, but also Black Lives Matter, the strengthening of the debate around LGBTQ+, and so on. What's the meaning of controversial? Because it seems this day, even just talking about monuments in this country, for example, almost everything becomes controversial. Has anything changed, or anything that you've seen happening would change the way you would go out and research and analyze? Has anything changed your gaze, or do you think that everything that you could go out and do exactly the same things?
I think it's good that we challenge our understanding of the world, and we try to be better people in all the respect from the recognition of rights to monuments, memorial, really, that in the end becomes just spaces where different conflicting meanings confront. As controversial, anything become controversial. So again, I would say it's okay that everything becomes controversial. So it's okay to have a debate, right? And controversial for me doesn't have any negative implication. It's just a word like another to define that around a monument, but it can be any other kind of text. Then there is a certain kind of conflict between different interpretative communities, I would call. So in this respect, I think we live a very interesting time. Necessarily, there are some limits, which, for example, in monuments and memorial, which are very difficult to overcome. as said before, to change completely all the names of the street in a city, it's quite a long process. And it implies, as you know better than I do, many different measures from I don't know, the planning department, the urban department, and so on and so forth. It costs. So we just need to find the right time and the right space, I would say, where to discuss our conflicts. So that's why I claim for turning monuments, for example, into learning venues rather than conflict, and how to assess with these controversies. I don't know if this answers your question.
It does, thank you. I think there is a hand up by Paul. First.
Yes, actually, you were just getting into something that that leads into my question. I think I was reminded, you know, when we were talking about the controversy, I was reminded of many years ago. I used to live in a flat with a woman and another guy, and the other guy was always late to pay bills. He always grumbled, and he didn't contribute to the Christmas tree that we bought one December. So me and the woman said, as we put the Christmas tree up, we're going to put the Christmas tree up, but he's not allowed to look at it, which of course is impossible because, you know, he's walking past it all the time. So my question, I suppose, is in relation to the controversy. Is it in fact that the controversy and some of the issues you cover in the book, do they change the nature of space? You know, particularly in the more recent controversies, you know, space and purview.
But I would say definitely the city center of Tallinn before 2007 and after 2007, while once the memorial that we were talking about before, the Bronze Soldier, was removed and relocated, was a totally different city center of Tallinn, not only in material terms, but also in the kind of emotion that were escalating during those days in April 2007, in terms of the fierce political debate, in terms of the ethnic inclusion and exclusion in Estonia. Now, we may not have time to go in details, but there were two very different interpretative community with different ideas of the past, which were divided also on an ethnic ground and also on a political ground, and also some far-right movement pushing, you know, to escalate tension and to get visibility also, as Augustine was saying before. So I would say that, yeah, they really changed the nature of ourself and of the space, if I may go so far.
Brilliant. I've got another couple of questions on the chat. So one is, in the case of Estonia, who is entitled to revise monuments and memorials, and how do we mediate between the different opinions? And that's from Gabriel again.
Mm-hmm. Well, like in most of country in European Union, the monument, the owner of the monument may be, for example, the nation state when it comes to a national monument, or the local government if it comes to, you know, a local monuments or memorial. There's also other kind of monuments, you know, monuments that just people put up, or monuments that are done in maybe in private premises by businesses, organization, association, and so on and so forth. I so far focused on the monuments managed by national and local government, and in that terms they have the possibility to, of course, remove, change. That's through, you know, democratic practices. So doing some law, doing some other measure at the legal level. I am not really familiar on this, so I may not use the right terms. And how do they mediate by different opinions? Well, there are several actually quite simple methods. So like the planners in this are, know better than I do. So focus group and some other participatory methods also using, the same simplicity that we use today every day. So do, for example, a forum online or a social media network where to discuss how to design a new memorial or how to deal with a memorial on a district and so on and so forth. So it's some very simple way to engage with the civil society and to get a broader view on how to deal with a certain monument.
And then there is an anecdote and a thought from Phil Ratcliffe, which I'm going to read. The idea that the public may not respect the official purpose of a monument reminded me of the Martyrs Memorial in Oxford, an elaborate Gothic stone pillar set on steps. Tourists sit on the steps to eat their lunch, see Google Street View, apparently unaware that this is the site where people were burnt at the stake. I think the space around it could be better designed to signal the significance of the site and the monument.
This is very interesting. The space around it could be better designed to signal the significance of the site of the monuments. That also give us the opportunity, for example, not to remove completely something from the past, right? But to put around signal, digital panel, augmented reality or virtual reality tools, projectoring, in order to give the perspective, right? So this is a monument which for the majority of people or for the nation state represent, for example, outdated values. We have no time, no resources, no possibility to change it. And in any case, part of our population would like to have it there as a reminder of what it was, there's also this narrative and so on and so forth. So let's put something around in order to give the ethical and ideological, the appropriate or current ethical and ideological reading to this memorial. In this respect, was more practical things that also, some unattentive use of monuments. And that's actually the majority of things. I live in Bologna now, and I meet at statues that represent people I actually don't know who they are, and I live here since quite a while.
Right, so it's now 6 o'clock, so I think we'll bring this to a close. Stay tuned, because we've said this is the start of a conversation, so something else will happen and you'll receive emails in due course about this, various things. I'd like to thank the audience for the wonderful debate, and also Neil and Agustin for reading the book and sharing their views and observations, to Paul for making us think how to bring things forward, to Federico for being so patient and so punctual and so clear in all his answers. One final thank, it goes to Tom Norton, who has managed everything from the shadows, really. To say it with him, this has been hosted through him, so we owe him that. But Federico, congratulations, and thank you very much for this really entertaining and thoughtful contribution, and for making us think further. Thank you, everybody.
It's me that I thank you. So I will try to keep it professional, as you say, but having you here, my supervisor at Cardiff, having my former colleagues and friends, Neil and Augustine, having two of my mentors from Semiotics, Paul Cobley and Kalevi Kul here, for me was just great, and it gives me the opportunity to, as you said, look at the future and push further. Thank you very much to you all, and especially to all the audience and and students that join us here in the conversation. Thank you very much.